We're continuing our discussion of fantasy. We are continuing more specifically our discussion of what you could say is racist fantasy, and we're focusing on the topic that I began last time. The topic there, my focus was to ask why the preponderance, the repetition, the frequency of a certain kind of depiction, a certain kind of image, if not scene per se, and that is of the body in pieces. And more specifically yet, not just any body in pieces, particularly certain types of mutilated bodies within, you could say, the white racist imaginary. I gave an example of a newspaper image that I'd seen in my youth, personalizing all of this, trying to locate it. And I'd started to give some further descriptions of how I felt that this was not an isolated image. That in fact, even in the worldwide, well, at least I suppose we could say North American Pulitzer winning domain of culture, that those images also seem to make an appearance. I'm going to refer now a little bit to a book that I wrote called Post-Apartheid Conditions. And I have a chapter here which is basically about the corpse mausoleum, the body in pieces within apartheid South Africa. But I should stress, it's not limited only to that sphere. So after having had that experience so many years ago and then starting to think about it in art history, I started trying to track how this particular type of depiction occurred in a variety of different cultural forms. The chapter in this book does some of that work, and I was kind of astounded by how omnipresent that emblem, that image was. This here of the mutilated body of the other. So I found a series of jokes, of crude racist jokes, where that kind of depiction comes up. I also started to realize that in a variety of news reports, even when there were examples of, say, for example, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had at its overriding agenda the need to redress structural racism, often one would find that the kinds of depictions, the kinds of photographs that were shown still evoked and displayed the dismembered, mutilated body, particularly of Africans, of black people. There's too many examples to enumerate. I'll just give one. I remember watching a documentary in South Africa. It was something like 40th anniversary of the SABC, South African Broadcasting Corporation. And there was the scene, there was an image of a man's head, and it was like a kind of, the camera zoomed out, and to begin with, you could see just the face of someone, and then of course, and the face looked fine. There didn't look anything wrong with it. And the more the camera zoomed out, you could see that this was just the shell, the front of a man's face, and there'd been a bomb. So why do this recurring theme come up again and again and again, even in these Pulitzer Award-winning photographs? Well, it was difficult to try to get a sense of that, but one theme that started to emerge the more I explored this was that in some ways, those images seem to be just one side of a coin. And interestingly, you'll recall that when we spoke about Zizek's understanding, developing on the Lacanian idea, that there's always two fantasies. There's fantasy one, so to speak, the stabilizing fantasy, and then there's the other fantasy, the destabilizing fantasy. It started to become apparent to me that this was one polarity, one side of a broader phantasmatic domain, of a broader phantasmatic kernel or concern or dynamism. That's also interestingly evocative of the diamond, that lozenge shape that we spoke about last time. Remember, the lozenge shape could be seen as different types of conveying different types of relationships, bigger than, smaller than. And it seems to me it's an apt description here, because not only do we have the horrifying images of bodily dismemberment, there's also another side to them. What's the other side? Well, here's the other side. Some colleagues and I were working on a project called the Apartheid Archive. And the Apartheid Archive project wanted to record many memories, recollections, stories, narratives of people that have lived through apartheid. And it was from a whole variety of different South Africans. So we collected several hundred of these, and we started doing an analysis. And one of them stood out to me, and I will just quickly read a section of it. The prompt was just to recall something to do with an experience of racism in the apartheid context. So this is one respondent who said, it was a written submission. Black men were somehow more hardy, thicker skulls, tougher bodies, more robust all round. I have memories of seeing black men being damaged, injured, stabbed in one occasion, hit by a car in another. And despite the attack, they seemed somehow fine. It was almost as if they were more bodily, somehow stronger. They seemed to be able to endure psychological damage. Or maybe all it was simply a remarkable inability to identify with the suffering of the black body. End quote. So what starts to become apparent, and of course then I kind of get sucked into the whole story because I'm thinking of my memories of growing up as a white South African kid in apartheid, and I'm suddenly confronted with the image of Shaka Zulu, the great Zulu warrior king, and images that I'd been exposed to and that I'd seen and imbibed. And Shaka Zulu's got all muscles and he's like an epitome of physicality. And then there's the Zulu warrior. And I remember these other experiences as a kid, seeing black men doing building work, throwing bricks to one another. And also these ideas, and again, this is not limited only to apartheid South Africa, of black athleticism, of the muscular black boxer, of the bodybuilder with magnificent physique. And I suppose what I'm trying to suggest here then is that the phantasmatic preoccupation with the body mutilated, the body broken, which incidentally we see Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask giving a very articulate, very explicit, visceral depiction of. In fact, he makes reference to these terms. He uses the imagery of the black body being broken apart. This is one of these moments, I think, where we see Fanon aptly, as it were, accessing the very stuff of white fantasy. He's doing it for two reasons. He's trying to exemplify the traumatic impact, the traumatic bodily impact of white racism, but you could say he's also evoking something of the racist white preoccupation with black bodies suffering, being broken. So Fanon uses this imagery of the bodies being broken apart, burnt, cut, exploded, eviscerated. Now, just while we're on this topic, we've tried to exemplify that the fantasy is, in a way, two opposite things at the same time, a plus and a minus. The destroyed body, but also the body superior, the body of physical, athletic excellence. It's kind of an odd two sides of the same coin. But let's also reiterate one of the ideas we stressed right at the beginning of these lectures, that sometimes fantasy is right on the surface. And I think we see that here. All of these kinds of cultural examples, from the black boxer, black athleticism, to all of these images of broken bodies. Many of these images one finds, or I found, in the popular press, in racist jokes, right at the very surface level of culture. It's not like they're necessarily deeply, deeply unconscious. Anyways, let's continue. That vacillation between these two modes of the fantasy, that vacillation between the black body in pieces on the one hand, and the black body as actually threatening, as somehow superior to the white body, is fascinating, and they both go together. In a further added on section of the narrative that I just read to you from the apartheid archive, the same respondent, who is a white man who's reflecting back on his white childhood, also speaks about how terrifying he thought it would be to play rugby, you know, the big cultural, masculine, whatever, male white preoccupation of South Africa, to play rugby against black boys. Why? Because they'd be so much stronger and you would tackle them and they would be tougher and you would get beaten up. So we have then a kind of complex here. It's nice to use that psychoanalytic term here, a complex of phantasmatic concerns, where at the same time the black body seems to exceed the white body, seems to, or put it in Lacanian terms, foreground the lack of the subject, or again using psychoanalytic terms, seems to foreground the lack or the castration of the white subject. And remember, that's one of the things that the fantasy does. It simultaneously tries to protect one from castration, but it also brings with it a slightly traumatic element. And I think that's essentially what we find in racist culture. In racist, white, big other culture, the preoccupation with those kinds of images is, you could say, one way of how the white subject, or white subjectivity, or white culture has tried to deal with the real, again using Lacanian terms, the challenges, the existential dilemmas of embodiment. In other words, we never show white bodies in pieces. But at some level, you could say that the white big other, whiteness, whatever, needs to deal with the fact of bodily death, bodily demise, the fact of potential mutilation, the body in pieces, which, if we follow Lacan, is the inheritance of all subjects. How does it deal with it? It deals with it by partitioning it, by delegating it to blackness. So that is the domain of the black subject. That's where we locate bodily suffering, bodily damage, bodily violence, bodily mutilation. I mentioned in the previous lecture that that phrase, Black Lives Matter, is an important one. And I think now we can see maybe why, in a sense, you could say it does talk to white fantasy. Because if what I've been saying is true, then you could say within the white, cultural, racist imaginary, black bodies are different. Black bodies can suffer. Black bodies should suffer. That it's not something that is appealed to or understood within a frame of reference that would immediately identify it as the same as the suffering of the white body. That's in a sense why I think it is phantasmatic. Let's draw all of these elements of this account to an end with a little narrative. As part of the research on all of this, I ended up trying to locate the journalist when that image that so affected me, and indeed you could say, I hate to admit it, but presumably my fantasy and my phantasmatic preoccupation with the image is precisely what drove the research. There was some frisson, some jouissance, again, I hate to say it, presumably in the gruesome image that motivated the whole thing. Nevertheless, I eventually tracked down the photographer and the newspaper. And I find out that what happened was that the Afrikaans South African newspaper that published the picture got into a lot of trouble. Because a lot of white families and a lot of people, let's face it, that a lot of people who would have seen that image and their first reaction would have been, a lot of white racist people would have said, maybe before they even realized it, a terrorist placed a bomb. He got what he deserved, right? So presumably something of that narrativization, that phantasmatic articulation was part of what the editor of the newspaper had thought when making the decision, should I even include this on the front cover? Going back to Freudian categories for a while, you could say, remember for Freud in the dream work, the preconscious has got to decide what's going to stay completely unconscious and what little bits I will allow out. It's almost a nice metaphor that editorial process, which I subsequently found out, if I remember correctly, the main editor wasn't there. So someone had to make the snap decision. They get the photographs late on Friday night, publish or not, and they decide in this kind of snap moment to publish. And it's a really interesting moment because what happens when it comes out, all these white families who at some level may have been kind of, look, he got what he's deserved. This is the state of the black body or whatever, were disturbed by the image. And there was a lot of pushback from the newspaper. People canceled subscriptions and a major advertiser said, we're not going to take our advertising to you anymore. What do we make of this? Well, you could say that maybe they had the right political and ethical, moral reasoning and saying, why are you publishing this? This is grotesque. And indeed, it's yet another exemplification of the black body being mutilated and shown up as a spectacle. And worse, showing up in a kind of obscene way, almost with a double-page spread, which kind of gives it that lascivious centerfold kind of feel. So you could say that a lot of people were objecting on that basis. But I suspect that a lot of people, and a lot of white people, were objecting for another reason. And I think that why that image was so unpalatable for many people was not simply, this is just my speculation, right? Was not simply that it's amoral, it's problematic to show anybody in this kind of state of physical destruction, dismemberment. But maybe that their enjoyment in the image came a little bit too close. And you'll remember when we spoke earlier about fantasy, there's this idea that fantasy weaves within it traumatic elements as well as pleasurable elements, and that for neurotic subjects, for the most part, your fantasy is okay. Maybe it comes a little close, but you don't want it coming too close. And you don't want to be in a situation where your fantasy is shown or made too clear. So my ending argument about all of this is it's a fascinating case study. It's a very troubling case study. And it's one that I think in many respects still seems to point to or epitomize elements of the white racist imaginary in its relationship to black bodily suffering. Hence, of course, Black Lives Matter. But nevertheless, let's conclude then that one of the elements of that phantasmatic staging, that phantasmatic image, which proved troublesome to white subjects, was that it staged the fantasy too explicitly. It's okay to maintain a kind of everyday, whatever, racist rhetoric and understanding and the jokes and all of these kinds of things, but if the subject is confronted too closely with their own jouissance in the fantasy, and their fantasy is too explicitly staged for other people to see, they will reject it and they will denounce it. Let's stop there.